Modern agriculture did not abandon this grain because it failed. It abandoned it because it refused to fail. For nearly 3,000 years, it stood in fields that outlived kingdoms. It ripened under bronze blades and iron sickles. It bent in dry winds where other crops collapsed. It endured poor soils, thin rains, careless rulers. It fed empires. And then, in less than a century, it was reduced to a footnote. Not outlawed, not burned, simply displaced, set aside for something more uniform, more profitable, more obedient to machines. What cannot be standardized cannot be scaled. What cannot be scaled cannot be owned. And what cannot be owned rarely survives inside a system built on ownership. This is the story of that grain. This channel exists as a vault, a quiet archive for the crops that built civilizations and were later erased from their own fields, for the seeds that survived conquest and climate only to disappear inside a catalog revision, for the agricultural systems that worked too well without permission. If you choose to remain here, consider subscribing not as a gesture of growth, but of preservation. Each story recorded becomes slightly harder to erase. Now, we open the archive. The grain in question is known today as emmer wheat. Long before modern wheat dominated the plains of North America and Europe, before combines carved geometric lines across continents, emmer stood at the center of human settlement. Its story begins in the Fertile Crescent, in the arc of land stretching from the Levant through northern Mesopotamia, roughly 8,000 to 6,000 BCE. In valleys watered by the Tigris and Euphrates, wild stands of early wheat were gathered by communities who had not yet decided to become farmers. They noticed something. Among the wild grasses, certain heads did not shatter easily. The grains clung to their stalks. They could be harvested before scattering to the ground. Those plants were carried back to early settlements, planted near dwellings, watched. Over generations, selection occurred, not in laboratories, but in memory. Emmer emerged from this patient observation. In ancient Akkadian tablets, references appeared to a grain known as kunashu. In early Hebrew texts, the word kusemet is often interpreted as emmer. Egyptian hieroglyphs depicted bundled in storehouses along the Nile. It was not an incidental crop. It was structural. Physically, emmer does not resemble the smooth, uniform wheat seen in modern fields. Its kernels are enclosed in a tough husk, tightly bound to the grain. After threshing, the chaff does not release easily. It must be pounded or milled with effort to free the edible core. This was once considered strength. The husk protected the grain from pests, from moisture, from decay in storage. In climates where humidity rose and fell unpredictably, where rodents slipped into granaries, emmer's armor mattered. Its stalks were tall, sometimes reaching over a meter in height. They swayed but did not collapse easily in dry winds. Its roots descended deeper than many modern wheat varieties, drawing moisture from soil layers others could not reach. It did not demand perfection. It tolerated marginal land, and it yielded reliably. In ancient Egypt, emmer was the primary wheat for over 2 millennia. Along the Nile floodplain, where annual inundation deposited silt and then receded, farmers broadcast seed into moist earth and waited. Records from the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE, list emmer harvests as taxation. Grain was currency. Grain was stability. Grain was state power. The pyramids were not built on ideology alone. They were built on stored emmer. In Mesopotamia, emmer traveled along trade routes linking Sumerian cities such as Ur and Lagash. Clay tablets detail rations paid to laborers in grain. Armies marched with it. Temples stored it. In 1274 BCE, when Egyptian and Hittite forces met at the Battle of Kadesh, their supply lines depended on grain like emmer, transportable, storable, sustaining. The Roman Empire inherited the crop centuries later. Though other wheats rose in prominence, emmer remained in cultivation across parts of Italy and the Mediterranean. Known in Latin as far, it gave rise to the word farina. Roman soldiers consumed pulse, a porridge often made from emmer. It was a grain of endurance. Biologically, emmer's resilience is not romantic invention. As a tetraploid wheat, it carries genetic diversity lost in many modern bread wheats. That diversity confers adaptability, tolerance to certain fungal diseases, ability to perform under lower fertility conditions, stability across variable rainfall. Its hulled nature reduces insect damage in storage. The husk acts as a barrier. It slows spoilage. It allows long-term preservation without chemical treatment. In climates marked by uncertainty, drought one year, flood the next, emmer absorbed fluctuation. It did not promise record yields. It promised survival. Through the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, when trade networks fractured and cities burned, emmer fields did not vanish. Archaeobotanical evidence from Levantine sites shows continued cultivation. When centralized authority faltered, small communities still required grain. Emmer did not depend on empire. Empire depended on emmer. In the early Islamic period, between the 7th and 10th centuries, emmer remained present in parts of North Africa and the Middle East, though other wheats gradually expanded. Agricultural manuals from Al-Andalus reference hulled wheats grown in drier regions where more delicate grains struggled. Then came Europe's medieval centuries. In parts of the Alps and the Italian Apennines, emmer persisted under local names, farro in central Italy, though terminology later blurred among related wheats. On thin mountain soils where rainfall patterns were harsh and unpredictable, emmer endured. It was rarely the most profitable crop, it was the most dependable. During times of famine, dependable becomes sacred. In 1315, Europe entered the Great Famine. Relentless rains destroyed harvests across northern regions. While wheat and rye yields plummeted, some areas with diversified plantings, including hardier hulled wheats, fared slightly better. Not immune, but buffered. For nearly 3,000 years, this was enough. So why did it fade? The answer begins not with failure in the field, but with pressure in the marketplace. By the 18th and 19th centuries, agricultural systems in Europe began shifting toward mechanization and centralized milling. Roller mills, introduced in the late 19th century, processed free threshing wheats more efficiently than hulled varieties. Emmer required additional steps to remove its husk. In small communities, that labor was accepted. In industrial systems, it was inconvenient. Uniformity became currency. Millers preferred grains that behaved predictably under steel rollers. Bakers demanded consistent flour characteristics. Governments measured yields per hectare as a metric of progress. Emmer, with its variable kernel size and lower peak yields compared to modern bread wheat, did not fit this model. It was unmanageable, unownable in the way new hybrid varieties could be owned. The Industrial Revolution altered not only machines, but expectations. Grain was no longer merely sustenance, it was commodity. Emmer retreated to marginal lands, then to subsistence plots, then to memory. The erasure was quiet. No decree banned emmer, no proclamation condemned it. It was simply edged out by efficiency. And yet, it did not vanish entirely. In isolated valleys of Ethiopia, related ancient wheats persisted. In the Garfagnana region of Tuscany, farmers maintained farro cultivation for local use. In parts of Turkey and the Levant, small communities continued planting hulled wheats out of habit or necessity. The knowledge did not disappear, it narrowed. Late 20th century researchers began revisiting ancient grains, not out of nostalgia, but curiosity. Genetic studies revealed emmer's role as a progenitor of modern durum and bread wheats. It was not a relic, it was ancestor. Its genome held traits breeders had inadvertently sidelined: disease resistance, stress tolerance, protein structure variations. Modern agronomists examining climate resilience have noted emmer's performance under lower input conditions. It competes well against weeds due to its height. It tolerates drought better than some high-yield varieties bred for irrigation. It was built for variability, and variability is returning. Climate patterns grow less predictable. Heat waves strike during flowering stages of modern wheat. Extreme rainfall events waterlog shallow roots. Soil degradation limits nutrient uptake in chemically dependent systems. The architecture of emmer, deeper roots, protective husk, genetic breadth, appears less archaic than it once did. Yet revival is not simple. For some rural families, emmer was the bread of poverty. Dense loaves baked when refined flour was scarce, thick porridge eaten during lean winters. When prosperity arrived, white bread became symbol of advancement. To return could feel like regression. Forgetting was not ignorance, it was aspiration. And yet, fragility reveals itself. Global wheat production is concentrated in a handful of regions. Fields planted with genetically similar varieties share vulnerabilities. A pathogen adapted to one often spreads rapidly across others. Diversity is insurance. Emmer embodies insurance. It survived collapse without synthetic fertilizer, without mechanized irrigation, without fungicide regimes. It was never engineered for abundance beyond measure. It was shaped for endurance. 3,000 years is long for an empire. It is brief for a plant. We did not lose emmer. We ignored it. The seed remains viable. The knowledge remains documented in fragments, in clay tablets, in manuscripts, in oral traditions of farming families. What sustains us does not require our recognition to function. It requires only space. Emmer fed empires that believed themselves permanent. Those empires dissolved. The grain endured. If this archive matters to you, consider subscribing, not for trend, but for record. The fields are older than our systems. The soil remembers longer than we do. And beneath modern rows of uniform wheat, the memory of another grain still waits, patient in husk and root, prepared, as it always has been, for whatever rises and whatever falls.